Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another lesson of how the story ends. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, preacher, you gave us notes like a month ago, and we're still working through the same 2 pages of notes. What is wrong with you? Are you trying to make extra money out of this or something by stretching it on and on and on? Or are you trying to eliminate all of the people who are watching until they just decide to give up and walk away? Well, mostly I've been finding connections between Revelation 19 and a lot of other stuff in Scripture. And some of the stuff is stuff that I don't often get a chance to teach about just in the normal flow of life. So I've been taking a few more rabbit trails lately during this particular set of notes, because there's some things that I really want to call your attention to. Now, you remember Revelation 19. We've already talked about the marriage supper of the Lamb, which is kind of like a preview of what the kingdom of God is going to be like on earth after Jesus returns. And then you have Jesus returning in chapter 19, verse 11. Heaven is open, there's a white horse, and there's someone seated on the horse, and he brings his armies down to earth. And there's this long description of who this person is sitting on this horse. He's faithful, he's true, he has eyes like fire. He is God's avenger. He is a righteous warrior. He determines his own identity. He is the Word of God, God himself. He's going to punish some at that battle, but he's also going to shepherd those who survive. And we'll talk more about that today. And he has the ultimate authority. He's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And we talked a lot about that last week. And we talked about his armies and who are those armies. I believe it's a combination of angels and Christians or believers who will be coming back with Jesus to help him set up his kingdom on earth. And then John foreshadows the battle by calling all the birds together. Remember that? For another supper, not like the marriage supper, which is something you should look forward to, but the supper of God, where the birds will be eating the flesh of the dead soldiers who defy God in this battle that's about to happen. And then we had just barely started talking about the battle itself, which is Revelation chapter 19, verse 19. And what I want to do is I want to start off by reading those 3 verses, and then we'll dive into it and pick up where we left off. Verse 19 says, "And I saw the beast and the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army." So basically what you see here is that the beast is defiant all the way to the very end. I don't know if he's foolish enough to think that he can win, or if he's just so far gone that the only thing left to do is just play it out to the very last thing, to play it out to the bottom of the ninth, 3 outs until the game is completely over. But he's determined. You have the beast, who's the Antichrist. You have the kings of the earth who are under his authority. And then you have their armies that are assembled here in this valley here outside of Jerusalem. And that is where the battle is going to take place. And what we find out is almost no description of the actual battle. We find out, though, and the next star there on your notes, is that the beast and the false prophet are captured and punished. And this is the first thing I want to talk about at some length with you today. So basically, I tried last week to kind of set the table by suggesting, okay, God judges and rewards people on a sliding scale. And here's what I mean by that. So we have the beast. Now, the beast commits some pretty flagrant sins, some pretty significant things that he does wrong, correct? Like the beast takes the place of Jesus Christ. That's why he's called the Antichrist. He sets himself up as God on earth to be worshipped. He kind of browbeats the kingdoms of the earth to follow his authority, to do what he says they need to do. And he kind of leads this global rebellion against God. So he's kind of got a pretty high level of accountability for everything that happens in the tribulation period, or the 70th week of the book of Daniel. If it wasn't for the beast, a lot of the stuff that happens wouldn't have happened. Then you have this false prophet. You remember him. He's the second beast that came up out of the water and who had a mission. And his mission is to make the entire earth worship the first beast. So he is more of a religious figure, and he is the one who's in charge of persecuting, rounding up humanity, and forcing humanity to choose between worshiping the beast and getting his mark and worshiping Jesus and being killed. Those are basically the only two options. So this guy has a significant amount of blood on his hands as well. He has been probably the one who has personally gone about the process of killing Christians and Jews who refuse to take the mark. And he's been the ringleader in trying to get the rest of the world to worship the first beast. So these two guys are kind of at the top of this horrible hierarchy of evil figures in the world. So let me just kind of go along with this. It says, so the beast is here at Armageddon with two other groups of people. There's the kings of the earth, and then it says their armies, okay? But those armies represent people, right? I don't know if it's thousands. I don't know if it's hundreds of thousands. I don't know if it's millions. All I know is that there's four distinct groups. There's the beast, there's the false prophet, there's the kings of the earth, and there's the armies. Now, I will say this. If the beast and the false prophets don't get the kings of the earth to do what they want them to do, then most of the things in the tribulation don't happen either. Most of the coordination that goes across nations wouldn't happen. And if these kings of the earth didn't have armies to enforce their will, then a lot of this stuff couldn't happen either. So I think we can all agree, right, that these four groups or these four figures all have a certain amount of accountability and responsibility and guilt in everything that happened in the tribulation period. I mean, at the very least, the fact that all of these armies and kings of the earth, the beasts, they all unite and take up their weapons and they kind of shake their fist at Jesus as he comes. And we're going to make war with you. We're going to make you sorry you ever came back to earth. That alone deserves a certain amount of punishment. But what we find out is that there's different levels of punishment given to these different groups of people because God does not punish everyone the same because people's sin is not the same. I know it's this really, it's like a trendy thing to say that someone who has been a serial killer is no different from somebody who one time disrespected their parents. Both of them have sinned, therefore both are accountable to God. I would absolutely agree with that statement. However, sometimes we make it seem like there's no difference between those two things. That to live a life, say, of a horrifying serial killer psychopath, that life is equally as punished as the life of the generally moral person who generally did some good things but tainted by selfishness and, of course, committed certain sins. Now, one thing that they do have in common is they're both condemned before the law. They both will experience the ultimate punishment of separation from God for eternity, okay? However, it seems like there are varying degrees of punishment for people based on how sinful their lives were, how much the consequences of their lives and of their sin affected the world around them. Okay, there's a difference between Adolf Hitler and a private in the German army fighting in the Battle of the Bulge to, hope that Germany wins the war. There's two different things there. And God, as the righteous judge, is going to hold people who were more accountable. He's going to hold them responsible, and the punishment for them is going to be more severe than it is for somebody that was kind of not as far up the food chain as far as making decisions go. Now, how do I see that here in this text? Well, for one thing, it says that the beast and the false prophet, so these guys are kind of lumped in together. They go directly to, not hell, not the place where people go today when they die separated from God. They go to something called the lake of fire. And I know I mentioned this last time, but just to review. The lake of fire is permanent. As far as we can tell, it's whatever hell is turned up to a factor of 10 probably. Okay? It's permanent, and right now it's empty. There's nobody there. It's a place awaiting a judgment, because before you can throw somebody in the lake of fire, God, as the judge, has to give due process and due cause as to why he's sending you to the lake of fire. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Maybe next week or maybe at the end of today. I don't know. So you don't just send somebody to the lake of fire without giving them their day in court. It's just the way God has set it up. And everybody in all the history of humanity is going to get their day in court. We're going to talk about it in chapter 20. It's called the Great White Throne Judgment. Okay? Everybody gets their day in court, except for these two guys. The beast and the false prophet are captured and they're thrown alive, screaming presumably, into the lake of fire. They just go straight, go directly to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200. You don't get your day in court. You don't get to testify. We don't look through the books, the book of life or the book of deeds to figure out what you did. No. Their sin is so heinous. It's so grievous. It's so over the top that God is going to send them alive into the lake of fire. Now, I don't know what effect that would have on them that would be any different than if they got to the lake of fire the other way, but it certainly is pointing out, hey, these guys are waiving, God is waiving their right to their day in court because their sins are so grievous and probably because their sins are so obvious. You don't need to have a day in court because it's just demonstrably true that they are responsible for mankind's rebellion against God. They were the two figureheads, okay? Now, what's interesting is the kings of the earth and the armies that show up at the Battle of Armageddon, they face a pretty serious consequence. Their serious consequence is death. And with death, the Bible says, there's separation from God in a place called hell. And that's not pleasant. It's not pleasant, but they also are entitled to their day in court. They're going to appear at that great white throne judgment, and they're going to get a chance to at least make their defense and also to have God put forth the case as to why they should also go to this lake of fire. So at the very least, you see a differentiation between the beast and the false prophet and the kings of the earth and the armies. Okay? They're going to be handled differently because I think they have a different level of responsibility within the hierarchy. And those of you that are at the top of the hierarchy, you're going to be judged more seriously. Now, think about this. Paul, at one point, and I can't remember the passage right now, is talking to pastors. And he says, look, or no, is it James? Yes, it's James. James, the brother of Jesus, who wrote a letter in the New Testament to a bunch of Christians spread around at that time. He says, look, not many of you should want to be teachers. Like it's trendy to want to be the cool person in front of the camera that everybody can talk to. But here's why you shouldn't want to be a teacher, right? You shouldn't want to be a teacher because those who use their words to teach God's truth on behalf of God will be held to a higher standard than those who don't. There is a greater sense of accountability and there's a greater sense of responsibility. And so when I say that I sometimes take things very seriously because I have to answer to God for the church, I mean it. Now, you as a member of our church or an attender at our church, you will be responsible for your choices, but I am accountable in some senses for how the entire church organization is run. And if I don't run it in such a way that all the people within it get a fair chance to grow in their faith, then I have failed in a more significant way. And God's going to hold me to a higher standard. Okay? I want to show you another passage in Matthew chapter, let's start with Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19. I know you have the reference there in your notes. Luke 19 says this, really interesting, in verse 11. Oh, wait, no, that's not the one I wanted. Oh, shoot, did I not write it down? I don't think I wrote it down. Anyway, let me just tell you the story. So Jesus at one point was going to a city, I think it was Bethsaida, where he had done a lot of miracles, like a ton of miracles. Like if you wanted proof that Jesus was supernatural, if you lived in that city, you probably were around when he had healed somebody or or caused the blind to see, or he had cast a demon out of something. Like, you saw it with your own eyes. And strangely enough, the people from this town come to Jesus and they say, hey, Jesus, we want a sign from you to prove who you are. And Jesus is like, what? That's crazy. I've already done a ton of miracles. I've already proven myself to you. Why do you need more proof? I'll tell you why. You want to show. You want to show. You want to be entertained. It's not that you're trying to make up your minds and you're trying to really be careful and only pick the right thing. You've already made up your minds that you're not going to believe, and you just want to be entertained by the show. And so Jesus said this. He says, the queen of the south will rise up on the day of judgment, and she will condemn you. Because when she heard about Solomon from a distance, she traveled to Solomon, and she listened to Solomon, and God spoke to her through Solomon. It says the queen of the south is going to condemn you because she didn't have nearly as much data as you have, and yet she was willing to respond to the little bit of truth she had. And so he says, you know what? It's going to be more tolerable for her on the day of judgment than it will be for you. It's just going to be more tolerable. Then he says, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah will find out that in their day of judgment, which is presumably the same day of judgment, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah are going to have an easier time, and they're going to get less of a punishment than you. Now, if I were an upstanding religious Jew in Bethsaida, I'd be like, what are you talking about? Sodom and Gomorrah, that was a wicked city. They oppressed people. They abused people. They went totally against the natural form of human life. Like, they were perverted and twisted. God, how could they be better than me? How could I get a worse punishment than them? It's because you don't understand. God is not handing out judgments based on how many times you sinned or what kind of sin you committed. How is God making his determination of what kind of punishment you deserve? He's basing it 100% on how much access you had to truth and whether or not you rejected that truth or not. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't have Jesus in their presence doing miracles. If they had have had Jesus in their presence doing miracles, they would have been held to the same accountability standard as the people of Bethsaida. But because they had less access to truth and they were destroyed, and now the people of Bethsaida had a ton of access to truth and they were going to be destroyed because of their unbelief, Jesus is warning them, hey, look, guys, on the day of judgment, when God is handing out punishments, yes, you guys are going to go to the lake of fire, and so are the people of Sodom, but somehow the judgment is going to be less severe for one than the other. And we see that illustrated here in this story. So another thing we notice is about rewards, right? You've heard the story. In fact, the two passages, Matthew 25 and Luke 19, that's the parable of the talents. You remember, I've heard this story, right? Where a guy is going away, a landowner, a master of the house is going away for a trip, and while he's gone, he leaves behind 10 talents of gold, 5 talents of gold, 5, 2, and 1 or something like that. And he says, hey, I want you to invest this money and give me a return when I get back. I want you to give me back my money plus whatever you've earned. And so he goes away, and he's gone for quite a while, and apparently it's been years, and he comes back, and everybody's like, oh, wow, he's back. And he's the guy who he gave 5 talents to, right? What did he invested it? And what he said, I made 5 talents more. So now, not only am I giving you back your original 5, master, I'm giving you 5 additional talents to enrich you because I took seriously your commands to do this while you were gone. And the same thing with the guy who had 2 talents. He worked really hard, and he got 2 talents back. So now he's offering double the investment. And then the guy who had 1 talent said, oh, I was afraid because I knew that if I messed up and I wasted your money, or if I invested it and I lost it, that you would be hard on me and you'd punish me, and so I dug a hole, buried it in the sand. Here you go. Here's your talent. Please don't hurt me. And the master is angry, and he takes the talent from the one guy and he gives it to the guy with 10 talents. And the point that Jesus is trying to make is that in the kingdom of God, you will be rewarded on a sliding scale based on how faithful you were to God's commands and to God's promise. So if God gave you a job to do and he only gave you 5 talents to do it, you work hard, you invest, you're going to get a greater reward than somebody who may have only 2 talents or 3 talents or maybe didn't invest the money at all, buried it in the ground. There's going to be differences. In the kingdom of God, some people are going to have greater rewards than others. It's just the way it works. And God is trying to point out, hey, and let me get you the blanks here. So the first arrow, right? Their punishment, the punishment of the beast and the false prophet, is distinguished. That's the blank there. Distinguished from the rest of the combatants, right? These guys over here. It's distinguished, and it's more serious. It's more severe. And then the side note is the second arrow. There are different degrees of punishment, just as there are different degrees of reward. Now, again, remember, this does not mean God likes somebody more than he likes someone else. God's love does not exist in degrees, where if, oh man, I really love that person, but I kind of love this. That's not how it works. The question is what did you do with what God gave you? Did you invest it and make a return on that investment? Did you bury it in the sand because you were afraid that if I make a mistake, God was going to crush me? Or were you just lazy and just didn't do anything at all? God says, look, I gave you something because I wanted you to live with it and invest it and do something with it. And we'll be rewarded accordingly. So if we don't take things seriously, Paul talks about the fact that if we build our house, use the illustration of building a house. If we build our house with materials that are of no value, they're worthless. Maybe we build our lives because we just want our career, and so our career becomes the dominant factor of our lives. And so we spend our entire resources building this amazing company or this amazing career, and I've got all these accomplishments, wow. And we come to the end of it and we realize that is not what God put you on the planet here to do. Now, that may have been a part of it, but what about your investment in your family? What about your investment in God's kingdom, in the church? Like, you ignored all the important stuff to build this one part up out of proportion. What's going to happen on the day of judgment? Paul says it's going to burn up. It's going to be put through a fire, and the fire is going to burn up and show that what you invested your life in wasn't significant. And Paul says, look, it's not like you're going to lose your salvation and miss out on heaven, but you're not going to have the rewards you could have had if you had been faithful. And I think we sort of understand that. We talk more about the reward side, but it's also true on the punishment side. If you had access to more information and you reject Jesus, you will be held to a higher standard than someone who doesn't have as much information and they reject Jesus, right? Like the tribal nations in parts of the world that have not even heard the name of Jesus, they will be held accountable because they are sinners and they've broken God's laws. But they're not going to be held accountable to the same extent that we are. And somehow, in the eternal punishment side of things, their punishment will be less severe than the punishment of those who had more access and turned away from it. So, yeah, my point I'm trying to make here is that with the beast and the false prophet and the kings of the earth and their armies, you see a differentiation in the kinds of punishment that are being used. And that's just to be expected. That's sort of just the way it goes. Now, let's keep going in the story, right? Back to Revelation 19. Revelation 19, we have, and the verse 20, and the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped its image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur, and were never heard from again. Like in the rest of the story, they're gone. They're just done. No hope for them. Just beyond the pale. But then we come to verse 21. So what happens to everybody else? What happens to these guys over here? And the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the horse, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh. The supper of God is complete. The birds are eating meat from the dead bodies of these corpses that have died. Now, when it says the sword that came out of Jesus' mouth, again, I don't imagine a literal sword spewing out of Jesus' mouth and, attacking and stabbing somebody in the heart or whatever. what I picture and what I think we're intended to understand is that something coming out of your mouth, what comes out of your mouth? Your breath, sometimes other things you don't want to mention in front of anybody. But usually your words, right? Your words, we visualize them as our words and the sound coming out of our mouth. I think what Jesus is going to do is by the power of his word, he is going to pronounce a death sentence. And everywhere in this valley, all of the combatants, all of the people who have shaken their fist at heaven, who have picked up their weapons and to make war with him, they're just going to go from standing to being dead. They're just going to be falling down on the ground. And all of the animals that they rode in on, the horses and so on, they're going to be dead as well. There's going to be a cataclysmic destruction of all of these people. So basically, all enemy combatants are executed by Jesus himself. I mentioned it last week. Jesus doesn't need an army. He doesn't need two armies for sure. I think he's bringing them anyway, the angels and his bride. But either way, Jesus doesn't need them. He can handle everything on his own. Remember, he upholds the universe. The universe holds together. If Jesus for 1 second stopped thinking about us, the entire universe would evaporate into nothing because he is what gives our universe reality. So if he wishes to, with the power of his mouth, the words that he speaks, just like he said, and the Father said back in Genesis 1, let there be light, and there was light. Like God didn't have to build it. It just existed because God willed it to be so. I think Jesus is going to will their execution for their crime of daring to pick up weapons against him as he comes back to earth to reign. And they will all die and they will all be executed by Jesus himself, by the word that comes from Jesus' mouth. Now, one more thing I want to do before we move on to the next set of notes is I want to show you a connection with an Old Testament passage. Old Testament prophets visualized the day when Jesus, they didn't know his name was Jesus at that point, but when the Messiah would return to earth, or they actually visualized it as the Lord himself returning to earth to battle against Israel's enemies and to destroy their enemies and set up the kingdom. So really, from their perspective, using the language that they understood at the time, they were describing this exact same event. And I want to go back to one of those passages that's the most kind of clear and the most direct. And I want to show you the correlations between these events and what happens in Revelation 19. Okay? So here we go. Turn back. This might be a challenge for you. Let's go back to the book of Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 14. Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit for you and say that Zechariah is the second to last book in the Old Testament. So if you go to the first pages of Matthew, you go this way, or wait, I'm trying to see which way you're watching me. If you go this way 3 pages, you come to the book of Malachi. That's what we preached on this last year. If you go just a couple pages more towards the beginning of the Bible, you have Zechariah. And Zechariah 14 is the very last chapter in the book of Zechariah. And what you see here is a description from an Old Testament perspective of this exact same thing. So let's read it. Let's draw some comparisons. And let's see if there's some new information in Zechariah that might help us understand what this battle is going to be like when Jesus returns to earth. Okay? So Zechariah chapter 14, look at verse 1. It says this, "Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst." In other words, all the things they stole from you, you'll get them back and they'll be redistributed back to you. Verse 2, "For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken and the houses plundered and the women raped." So the first thing we see that's the same is that God is going to gather all the nations of Jerusalem to battle. They're going to come there for a final confrontation. And in the process, it seems like the whole city of Jerusalem will be captured by the beast and his forces, and they will just devastate and destroy, as marauding armies tend to do since the dawn of time. Okay, so that's the first thing. All the nations, all the Gentile nations are going to gather together. The kings of the earth and their armies, right, are gathered together to make war in the Holy Land outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself will be taken. Let's keep going. Verse 3. Okay, I'm sorry. Half of the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So some people will be outside the city in exile. Half the people will still be living there. Verse 3, then Yahweh, or the Lord, will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. This is kind of cool. This is God himself returning to earth. This is like God inserting himself back into the story. So much of the Old Testament story is God's faithful ones going, God, where are you? The wicked are destroying us, whether it's wicked Jews or wicked Gentiles. Somebody is always oppressing us. When are you going to come back? When are you going to establish your kingdom? When is all the bad stuff going to go away? And Zechariah 14:3 says, then the Lord will go out that day and fight. He's not going to send somebody else to do it for him, right? Well, how does that fit with what we saw from Revelation 19? Jesus himself, with the sword coming from his mouth, will destroy the nations. This is the promise. This is Jesus fulfilling what Zechariah promised, that the Lord himself, Jesus himself, will fight for them. Take a look at verse 4. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward and the other half southward. Like when Jesus finally touches down, he's going to touch down on the Mount of Olives. Now, I've had the privilege of going to the Mount of Olives. And from the Mount of Olives, you can see spread out in front of you the entire city of Jerusalem. It's just a beautiful, breathtaking sight. Just amazing. Well, that's where Jesus is coming back to. And when he touches down on earth, that's where his feet are going to touch. And literally the earth is going to give way before him. Like he has some significance and some weight to him. His mere presence touching the earth causes the Mount of Olives to split and create this huge chasm. And I imagine it's going to be absolutely devastating for the city. You remember one of the things we talked about, one of the judgments? One of the judgments is that the city of Jerusalem will be broken up into a bunch of pieces. Wouldn't surprise me if this prophecy here of Jesus stepping down on the Mount of Olives is part of what leads to that giant earthquake that we talk about a little bit earlier on in Revelation. So either way here in verse 3 and 4, you see the Lord will come back. Jesus is going to take he's going to come on behalf of God. He's going to touch down on Mount Olives. He's going to split it and kind of redefine the entire geography. And then verse 5, right? Verse 5 says, and you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to us all, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. So basically when Jesus comes, all the people that are still faithful to Jesus, when he shows up, they're heading out of Dodge. Like they're like, we're out of here. We're not going to wait and see what happens. Like, oh my gosh, he's here. They run to get as far away from the city as they can because they know the judgment is about to fall. And then this says, verse 5, then the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with him. So again, how does that connect with Revelation 19? When Jesus comes, he brings his armies with him, his holy ones. Another way of saying holy ones is saints. Now, sometimes the term holy one is used to describe angels because they're also sinless. Okay, so 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I think it's still very ambiguous as to which he intends, angels or humans. But either way, we find out that God is going to come back personally in the form of Jesus. He's going to bring his armies with him, and all the people that are still alive that are on his side are going to run for the hills because they know what is about to happen to this. Now, here's a new piece of information, except that we sort of saw it already in Matthew 24. We'll get back into that. Look at verse 6 and 7. On that day, there shall be no light, no cold or frost, and there shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light. So you're like, what is going on here? Well, if you go back with me to Matthew chapter 24, Matthew 24 is Jesus's main teaching about his return to earth. And he says this in verse 29 of Matthew 24. He says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So what Zechariah is saying, and hold on to that, by the way, keep your finger or a marker in Matthew 24, because we'll be back there in just a moment. But what Zechariah is saying is exactly what Jesus said. There's going to be a supernatural darkening of all of the light sources. We're going to go pitch black. So this is going to be a day, there's going to be it's going to be a unique day, Zechariah says. Like there's going to be no day like this in the history of humanity. And it's neither day nor night. Okay, when you expected light, it was dark. And then at some point, when you would expect darkness, the sign of Jesus splitting open heaven and returning in all of his glorious power, that light is going to reintroduce light to the world. And so it's going to be like this weird day. Is it daytime? Is it nighttime? Is it up? Is it down? We don't know. And Zechariah matches very carefully what Jesus said in Matthew 24. Jesus, when he's saying this, he's not just randomly throwing things together. He's going based off his understanding of the Old Testament prophets. And I think it's helpful to kind of connect some of these dots. Now, look at this next one. This is really cool. Verse 8. On that day, living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter. Living water. I want you to hold on to that one, because when we get to the eternal state, we see that there is living water coming from the throne of God on earth, spreading throughout the world. And then we're also going to take a look at that point to another passage in Ezekiel 47, which was written actually a little bit before, I think, Zechariah was written. And in Ezekiel 47, God says, when I set up my new temple, when I set up my new place of worship in the kingdom, there's going to be healing, living water that flows through. And of course, we have to think of Jesus and his teachings, right? Saying, I have living water to drink. Okay? This is deliberate. Jesus is using this imagery to help us understand he's the one being pictured here. His kingdom is going to bring living water to the entire world, which is one of the reasons why when we get to the kingdom, everything has been revived. Why is it revived? Because now there's living water spreading throughout the earth to kind of bring everything back to the way it was supposed to be. Now, we'll come back to those connections when we get to Revelation 21, but I just wanted, or 22 actually, but I wanted you to kind of see that living waters thing here. Look at verse 9. It says, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. In other words, Zechariah is saying this is not a victory where God's going to come, beat the bad guys, and then go back to heaven and all that stuff. No, he's coming, and he's coming to stay. And when he comes, his mission is going to be the king over all the earth. And that's exactly what we saw in Revelation 19, that Jesus has the purpose to rule the nations, yes, with a rod of iron, but he's going to shepherd the nations as their king. He's called the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And there's going to be nobody to challenge him. It says, on that day, the Lord will be one and his name one. In other words, there's no more false gods. There's nobody saying, oh, yeah, well, I'm Buddha, and I think you should go about this. Oh, I'm a Hindu, and I believe in this Allah. There's going to be no competition. There's going to be no false prophets. There's going to be no false gods, no false religions. There's going to be one true God. And after all these millennia of wrestling, well, I don't know, is God real? Is God the true way to heaven? Is all that? You have all these questions. Well, in this moment, it's all going to be settled. And the Lord alone will be the king over the earth, as he said he would. Now look at verses 10 and 11. The whole land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. Now, here's a little side note. If you've never been to Jerusalem, Jerusalem is in the middle of a mountainous, rocky area in southern Israel. In fact, the reason why Jerusalem was such an important city in the ancient world is because of where it's placed in the high ground. They could kind of control and command and be in a great position, at least for defense, against any armies coming at them in that valley because they have the high ground. Okay, so Jerusalem was always an important city. That's why David wanted it for his capital. It kind of commands the entire area. Well, apparently, with Jesus touching down on the Mount of Olives and ripping open this, and half the mountain goes this way, All of the earth is going at this part of Jerusalem, this part of Israel, outside Jerusalem, is everything's going to be level and it's going to be flat. But Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. So picture this, okay? I know it's a little bit weird, but the details are important. So Jerusalem right now is up high in a ring of mountains, hills, not really mountains, what we would think of like Rocky Mountains, but hills that command the view of the whole valley. And there's like, it's all broken up. Well, apparently, Jerusalem's going to stay where Jerusalem is, and everything else is going to get lowered and spread out flat. Now, what effect is that going to have? No, it doesn't affect your eternal salvation, but it's an interesting point. Everything else is going to be lowered and humbled, but Jerusalem is going to remain elevated. So if you're anywhere in the plain, all you have to do, where's Jerusalem? Well, it's the only thing we can see that rises above the level of ground where we're at. I visited Alaska once, and I'll tell you what, I've never been around the Rockies like I was when I was in Alaska, but I'm telling you, there's massive, huge mountains, and I remember I would walk outside, and I'm sure if I lived in Alaska, I'd get used to them, but like I'd walk outside after dinner, or maybe we're going out to go work on a project at the camp that we were serving at, and all of a sudden, I couldn't help, my eyes would just go to the hills. I would just lift up and look at that because it's just so majestic. It rises from the ground, and especially if it's the only thing that's above a certain level, everything else is flat and a plain. It means Jerusalem, which had been the center of the Davidic monarchy, is now going to be the center of God's kingdom on earth, and it's going to be raised up so that anybody around the area who wants to see where God is, where God's throne is, where God's kingdom begins, it begins up there on the mountain where God is, up in Jerusalem. And look at verse 11, and it shall be inhabited, and there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. See, that's the thing. It's really interesting side story point here. Jerusalem, throughout the entire history of the Old Testament, especially of all the kings from David onward to, Zedekiah, who is the son of Josiah, who ended up being destroyed by Babylon and all that stuff. Anyway, so from 1,000 to, so like 400 years. I mean, we're talking a long time, okay? Whoever controlled Jerusalem was constantly under threat. Because if there was a big bad army coming through the area, they knew they had to take out Jerusalem before they could control the valleys around it. So Jerusalem constantly lived under the threat of attack from this group or from that group. And so there was always this, and so that's one of the reasons why the kings would sometimes get seduced into worshiping false gods, because they wanted desperately for protection for their city. Their country wasn't very strong, but their city was important to them. So they would worship the false gods and hope that these false gods would protect them from all the armies marauding through the area, because armies had to travel through there to get to Egypt or to get up to where Babylon was. So it was like on this highway, and there's Jerusalem. And God is saying, look, finally, after hundreds and thousands of years of feeling threatened, you're going to be safe. Just safe. And it's going to be inhabited again. All the people are going to live there. There's going to be joy and celebration. The king's going to be there. It's going to be a place of happiness and a place of prosperity and a place where justice flows and living waters are flowing out from that mountain. Can you imagine the cascades of waterfalls, one to the west, one to the east, just cascading down the mountains and forming this incredible river that stretches out from west to east. An amazing thing. In Jerusalem, the people who are always under threat, who are always having somebody wanting to come and destroy them and control them and oppress them, Jerusalem will dwell in safety. That is no small thing. That's a big deal to the writers of Scripture. To the people of Israel, that's a big deal. Like, I think even now, when I visited the city of Jerusalem, modern day Jerusalem in modern day Israel, everywhere you go, well, first of all, you know the way Israel works, right? Like, if you're a high school graduate, unless you have a very narrow set of exceptions, you spend, I think it's 2 years as a part of the military, required military service for all teens graduating high school. Not if I feel like I want to go into, no, everybody. Now, why would they have a silly rule like that? The silly rule is because, let's see, 1948, 1954, 1967, 1973. So we'll just stick with those four. 4 times in the space of less than 30 years, the Arab nations around Israel tried to completely wipe Israel off the map. 4 times in 30 years, less than 30 years. And one time, the 6-Day War, they got so close that the word on the street was that the Israelis were considering nuclear weapons as their last-ditch effort to try to stop this from happening. They were that bad. They were that close to being completely overrun by the Arabs. And then the battles turned and Israel ended up winning the war. But it was pretty serious. Israel has been under a constant threat of violence and destruction at least since its inception in 1948. To this day, there are nations around Israel that are pledged and committed to the complete destruction of their way of life. So all of their kids go to serve in the military for 2 years. You know, Wonder Woman, Gal Gadot, she spent her 2 years in the military as well. And then she went off and became a movie star and stuff like that. People just do that. That's just part of the culture of Israel because they're under constant threat. In fact, it was really funny. We would walk around like just the touristy places. Right? We were just tourists. We weren't anything big deal. We're just walking around touristy places. People in shorts and like tank tops walking around with their flip-flops, and they've got an M16 rifle slung over their shoulder or an AK-47 or what. I'm not an expert on guns. Some of you are gun people could tell me a lot better than I can. They'd be walking around with their weapons, and if they would stop and talk to you, because they were very friendly, very, very kind and friendly people for the most part that I met, they would talk and they'd mess with us about Bill Clinton, who was our president back then and stuff. It was kind of funny. And they would say things like, they would just talk, just like they weren't carrying a submachine gun or a machine gun on their shoulder. But again, they have to do that because they're constantly under threat. So this is a beautiful promise from Zechariah. Not to get too far off the beaten path here. Jerusalem will dwell securely. Now look at this. Verse 12. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. Now that's like a B-movie horror, like B-level horror movie type stuff. You're alive, you're rotting dead in a moment, in a second. Is it a wonder that they call all the birds of the flesh and the carrion consumers to come and take care of all these dead bodies? Jesus, when he speaks his word, whatever word he speaks to execute them, their eyes will rot in their heads, their tongues will rot in their mouths, and their flesh will just turn to rot. They don't have to lay on the ground for very long. They're completely rotten. Can you imagine the smell? I mean, just horrifying experience. Verse 13, and on that day a great panic from the Lord shall fall on them, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of the one will be raised against the hand of the other. Even Judah will fight at Jerusalem. The wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected. And a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, and whatever beasts may be in those camps. Like, the destruction is complete. And it's horrifying. It's terrifying. But that is a description, I guess a much more gory description of what's going to happen to these people when the sword comes from Jesus' mouth and he removes life from them. They're going to fall and hit the ground dead, and their body's already in the process of putrefaction and rotting. And then the birds of the air are going to come, and they're going to have their great feast, their great supper. It's pretty crazy. Now, one last paragraph, and then we're done. And then we'll go right back to our notes and finish up a couple blanks. Then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. Now, this is so fascinating. Remember how I told you that there were going to be non-combatants who were going to survive, and Jesus was going to give the opportunity to some of them to enter into his kingdom as his subjects, right? The sheep, those are the ones that protected and looked out for and tried to hide and provide for the needs of Jews and Christians who were persecuted for their faith during the time of the tribulation. Those people now are going to have the opportunity to go up year after year to worship the King in Jerusalem and to celebrate those things. So those holidays, those special feasts, the Feast of Booths, it says here in verse 16. Now, that's pretty cool, right? That's God making peace with his enemies and then inviting them to be a part of the worship of himself. Like, this is God not just saying, okay, I'm not going to kill you guys now. You go away and don't talk to me and I won't talk to you. And you stay in your world and I'll stay in mine. And I don't care what happens to you. You don't care what happens. No, this is God saying, look, I want to welcome you in. I want to invite you in on an equal level with my people, the Jews and the Christians who had embraced this during the tribulation. I want you in on this. Come on up and worship. Come on up to Jerusalem. We're having the Feast of Booths. You're going to love it. We're going to cut down, make these little shelters. We're going to sleep in them. We're going to be like camping. We're going to celebrate God's goodness and greatness. Come up for the Passover. This is when we remember that our King on the throne actually died for our sins and was the basis by which God could forgive us. Oh, and come for the Day of Atonement, because on the Day of Atonement, we're going to remember how the death of Jesus on the cross wiped away all of our sin. Like, come for these feasts. You're going to love them. They're going to be great celebrations and reminders of what went on before. Gentiles who should have no right to be participants are going to be invited to be a part of it. And then take a look here. Verse 17. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, there will be no rain on them. Remember how he said he's going to shepherd the nations with a rod of iron? In other words, there's going to be consequences for disobedience. So the consequence is you don't come up. Maybe you're like, we don't like him. We're going to stay home. You stay home, there's going to be no rain on your land. Verse 18, if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, then on them there shall be no rain, and there shall be the plague, with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. This shall be the punishment to Egypt and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep them. In other words, Jesus is going to rule, and he's going to be a good king, a shepherd who is looking out for the good of his people. He wants to invite everyone, Jew and Gentile, to be a part of his worship, of his family. He wants that. But there will be consequences for those who disobey during the time of his kingdom. Now, we'll jump into that a little bit more maybe next time. But let me come back to my final statement here. Why is Jesus doing all of this? Why? Why is he executing everybody and throwing the beast and the false prophet in the lake of fire? Like, why couldn't he have done something else? Isn't there some kind of diplomacy he could have chosen? And bottom line is this. Okay, the first arrow. The pretenders to the throne must be removed before Jesus can establish his kingdom. The pretenders have to be eliminated. Okay, it's one thing if you're just kind of going along with the person who's trying to take over the country. You can't have two people trying to run the country at once. And so if you're gonna set up a new kingdom, you have to eliminate and remove the old one. And so the beast and the false prophet cannot coexist with Jesus. There are consequences to shaking your fist at heaven and making war upon him. There's consequences to that. And the bad guy has to be removed before the good guy, so to speak, can be set up in his place. And so Jesus is doing this not because he loves violence, I don't think. Not because he delights in bloodshed and the death of so many thousands of people. I think he's doing this because he knows if he's going to set up his kingdom, he has to get rid of those pretenders who would try to undermine his kingdom. And then the last thing, why is he doing this? Why does he come back? Why does he fight the evil? Why does he destroy the wicked? Well, the second arrow says God's people must be rescued. That's the blank there. Rescued from their oppressors before the marriage feast can begin. And then there's all these passages, and I want you to look them up sometime. Deuteronomy 3, Jeremiah 32, Ezekiel 34 and 36, Matthew 13 and 24, and Mark 13, 27. Like, all these verses talk about the fact that before God's kingdom can come, before this kingdom can be established, there's got to be an account held for the wicked. Because the wicked are oppressing the righteous. And if God is going to come, he has to rescue his people from the people who are trying to oppress them. And that's what this text is really all about. That's what this story is about. That's why Jesus comes and takes such drastic measures. He's not just delighting in war because he's Mars, the god of war, and he just loves to destroy. He's bloodthirsty and destroy, destroy. That's not it at all. That's not the point. That's not what God is after. That's not what God is trying to do. Jesus is coming back to rescue his people, to remove the people who have set themselves up as the king in his absence so that he can establish his kingdom. Now, next week, we're going to dive into Revelation chapter 20. And there's some really, really interesting stuff that happens here. It's going to take us a couple of weeks to get through chapter 20 because we're going to take a look at, okay, so the beast and the false prophet have been dealt with. But who's the puppet master who's been pulling their strings all along? We found out in Revelation chapter 12, it's the dragon. And this dragon is none other than God's ancient enemy, Satan, who has been working against his purposes forever. And so that's what this next section is about. And from there, we're going to get a description of what that 1,000-year kingdom on earth looked like. And then we're going to move on to some other strange and cool stuff in Revelation chapter 20. But the key thing I want you to remember, this is harsh. It's hard to deal with. Some people who get a little squeamish about it think, oh, couldn't there have been a more peaceful way that Jesus could have handled this? Not at this point. Not at this point. When you have the assembled armies of the world gathered together to make war upon you, the only way to stop the rebellion is to crush it. These men, and I don't know, there may be women fighting as well, who are in these armies, and the beast and the false prophet, all of these people have crossed so many lines. They become so committed to their own selfish, rebellious, independent way of life that they're just determined this is what's going to happen. And so in order for Jesus to move them in order for him to set up his kingdom and rescue his own people that are being oppressed, he's got to eliminate them. Okay? Sometimes the picture of Jesus is not maybe the prim and proper, nice, clean, pristine, airbrushed Jesus that we see in some of our kids' materials about Jesus. Like, this is Jesus the warrior. Finally, after giving mankind umpteen chances to turn around, that finally it says, enough is enough. In order to bring about my kingdom, I've got to eliminate the pretenders. I've got to rescue my people so that we can finally start the marriage feast. So we can finally start the marriage supper, and we can sit on the mountain of Jerusalem. That's the only mountain left. Everything else is a plain around. When people come over here, they're going to celebrate the Feast of Booths with us. They're going to come over and do. When that happens, oh, what a delight. What a joy. We will finally have the world the way it was meant to be. And I can't wait to keep going because the last 3 chapters of the Bible might be the 3 best. We'll talk more about it next week. God bless you. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.